When I saw the car pulling up the gravel road, my stomach clenched in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something colder, deeper, like the air before a storm. I recognized the shape of the vehicle long before I saw his face through the windshield. My husband. The man I had shared my life with for 2 decades. The man who wasn't supposed to be here until Sunday. The man who had sent his son in his place so I wouldn't have to be alone. So I could breathe. I stood at the window, frozen, still holding the mug of tea that had long gone cold in my hands. Behind me, I could hear the soft rhythm of another person's breathing. Steady. Familiar now. He was still asleep. In our bed. I didn't move. Not when the car door slammed. Not when he grabbed his duffel bag from the back seat. Not even when his footsteps started up the porch stairs. All I could do was watch and wait and relive everything that had brought us here. Because this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't an accident. And when he opened that door and stepped inside, when he looked into my eyes and saw what he wasn't meant to see, I knew the truth would no longer be something I could manage or bury or explain. I knew that the version of myself I had protected for so long had already been shattered, piece by piece, starting from the very moment I stepped into that cabin with my husband's son. Let me take you back to the beginning. To the moment when it all should have been innocent. Just a trip. Just a quiet weekend. Just something to pass the time. Until it wasn't. Before I begin, write in the comments where you're watching from and tell me, have you ever crossed a line you swore you never would? The cabin smelled like pine and old books, the kind of scent that sinks deep into wood and fabric and lingers long after you've left. I remember walking in and setting my bag down by the door, brushing pine needles off my sleeve, and listening to the sound of the gravel still settling outside. He hadn't come in yet. I could hear him unloading the car, our bags, the cooler, the hiking boots my husband had insisted we bring even though I hadn't worn mine in years. The silence inside was thicker than expected. There were no clocks ticking, no hum from appliances. Just a stillness that pressed against my ears and reminded me how far we were from the city. From phones. From anything normal. I ran my hand along the edge of the small dining table and glanced toward the single bed. Just one. I had called the booking company the day before to confirm. They'd assured me it was a rustic double and that 2 beds could be arranged if needed. Clearly, they hadn't. He stepped inside then, his arms full of gear, and said something about how great the air smelled. I nodded but didn't really respond. My eyes were still on the bed. He followed my gaze and went quiet too. The tension was immediate. Not loud or awkward, but present. Like the scent of something faintly burning in the other room. We didn't talk about it. Not right then. We unpacked in a kind of synchronized avoidance, me stacking canned goods in the kitchen nook, him laying his clothes over the arm of the couch. I watched him from the corner of my eye. Taller than I remembered. Broad-shouldered. Confident, in a casual way. He caught me looking once, and I turned away too fast, knocking over a tin of coffee in the process. He helped me pick it up. Our fingers brushed. We both laughed too quickly. Later, over dinner, we finally sat. The meal was quiet, store-bought pasta, canned sauce, red wine neither of us really liked. The kind of meal that fills space more than stomachs. He asked how work was going. I told him it was the same at clients, meetings, people expecting too much for too little. He smiled, said something about how I always made things look easy. I looked at him longer than I should have. It was a strange compliment, because it didn't feel like small talk. It felt noticed. And I couldn't remember the last time someone had really seen me like that. After dinner, we cleaned together. He washed. I dried. When he reached for a plate, his wrist brushed my arm. He apologized, but I barely heard him. My skin was buzzing. I looked up. His face was close. Closer than I'd expected. That night, I offered to sleep on the couch. He refused. Said it wasn't right. That he'd take the couch. But it was small, too short for his frame. He tried anyway. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to him shifting below. An hour passed. Then 2. I finally got up and told him to come to bed. That we were adults. That there was nothing wrong with sharing space. He hesitated, then nodded. When he lay down beside me, he stayed at the very edge. As far as the mattress would allow. I did the same. But I felt the heat from his body like a pulse in the dark. I tried to slow my breathing. Tried to think of other things. I thought of my husband. Of the way he hadn't kissed me goodbye before this trip. Of the silence during our last dinner together. How we'd run out of things to say. Or how maybe I'd just run out of ways to make silence feel like comfort instead of punishment. I thought of how long it had been since anyone had touched me with intention. Not just familiarity. Not routine. But that charged, electric attention that used to exist in the early days. Before obligation replaced spontaneity. I don't know how long I lay awake, but I didn't sleep much. At some point, I turned to face the wall, tucking the blanket under my chin like a child. I heard him shift too. Neither of us spoke. In the morning, I woke before him. The light was soft, filtered through thin curtains, and painted gold across the floorboards. I stayed still, listening to the rhythm of his breath. There was nothing inappropriate about what had happened. Nothing that crossed a boundary. Not yet. But something had changed. Something unspoken. And in that quiet moment, staring at the ceiling of a cabin far from the world I called home, I knew something else too. We hadn't made a mistake. Not yet. But we were standing on the edge of one. And it wouldn't take much to fall. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains like a slow confession. I lay still, wrapped in the sheets that no longer felt neutral. They smelled of pine, yes, but also of skin, of breath, of shared silence. I could hear him moving quietly in the kitchen, opening drawers, trying not to wake me. But I was already awake. Had been for a while. My eyes traced the ceiling beams above, worn and uneven, like the things we try to hold in place long after they start to splinter. He knocked softly on the frame of the open bedroom door. Not entering, just waiting. I turned toward the sound. He held out a mug, the steam curling up toward his face, his expression unreadable. I sat up and took it without a word. Our fingers touched. We held each other's eyes a second too long. The coffee was too strong, a little bitter. I drank it anyway. We didn't talk much over breakfast. The few words exchanged felt like placeholders, too light for the weight between us. I asked what the plan for the day was. He shrugged and said he thought we could hike a little, maybe find the old fire tower trail. I nodded like it made sense, like I wasn't drowning in something unnameable. Like my mind hadn't already started turning our silence into memory. We packed snacks and water and set out just before noon. The sky was a crisp blue, the air sharp with autumn. Leaves crunched underfoot, and I watched him move ahead of me, confident, aware of the path. I realized I was watching his back the way someone might look at a familiar painting that suddenly seemed foreign. I had known this person in another life, when he was a child, when I was a different version of myself. But now, in this moment, the familiarity felt dangerous. We walked in near silence, with only the occasional comment about the trail, the incline, the roots underfoot. When we reached the top of the hill, the view opened up suddenly, wide valleys, tree canopies in golden fire, and a horizon that looked like it belonged to someone else's story. He sat down on a large rock, motioned for me to join him. I hesitated. Then sat. It took a while before either of us spoke. He asked how I'd met his father. I told him the truth, quickly, simply. A gallery opening. A conversation about a sculpture. A dinner that led to more. He listened quietly. When I asked if he remembered that time, he said he remembered the silence in their house growing quieter after I moved in. I flinched. He apologized, quickly, awkwardly. I told him it was okay, but we both knew it wasn't. There were things you could smooth over with time, but not erase. And yet, we kept trying, didn't we? Pretending to be more than we were, or maybe less. I looked out at the trees, blinking against the wind. Then he said it, just like that, soft and almost lost to the breeze, "You seem different here." I turned toward him, my throat dry. He didn't look away. "Less hidden," he added. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I had no other safe response. I told him it was the fresh air. He nodded like he believed it, but his eyes said otherwise. We started the walk back late in the afternoon. The light had changed, grown lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I tripped once on a root, and he caught my arm. We didn't speak, but his hand lingered. Just for a second. Enough. At the cabin, we cooked again. Simpler this time, soup from a can, bread warmed in the oven. We ate with quiet comfort, like two people who had run out of things to say but still wanted to be near each other. After dinner, he cleaned up while I went to sit outside on the porch. The air had grown cooler. I wrapped a blanket around myself and stared into the trees. He joined me not long after, holding 2 glasses of wine. We didn't toast. Just sat. A pair of owls called to each other across the forest, and the sound made something in me ache. I turned to him, and he was already looking at me. The moment stretched. He said nothing. I said nothing. And then we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was just quiet. A question neither of us had words for, answered all at once. And then we pulled apart. I stood and went inside, not looking back. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, heartbeat racing. He didn't follow. I listened for footsteps, but they never came. Instead, I heard the door close softly downstairs, the floorboards creak under his weight as he walked away, back to the couch, back to the version of himself he was trying to protect. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in that space between shame and clarity, torn between what I felt and what I feared. Not just about what we had done, but about what it meant. About what couldn't be undone now. And when I finally drifted off, the taste of that kiss still lingered, like a secret I hadn't meant to speak aloud. The morning after felt suspended in a kind of stillness that didn't belong to ordinary time. I opened my eyes to a room bathed in pale gray light. The silence was intact, no footfalls, no voices, just the whisper of trees beyond the walls and the faint creak of timber expanding in the cold. I stayed in bed longer than I should have, reluctant to face the weight of the previous day, reluctant to discover whether everything would now be different, or whether it would all be forcibly returned to how it was before. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, he was already dressed, standing near the window, holding a half-empty mug. He didn't turn around. I poured myself some coffee from the pot he'd made and took a seat at the small wooden table, suddenly aware of how loud even the smallest movement sounded in that space. We exchanged only a few words. He asked if I'd slept. I said, not really. He nodded but didn't elaborate. Neither of us mentioned the kiss. Neither of us dared. There was a strained politeness between us, the kind that feels more fragile than silence. We made plans to drive into town for more supplies, milk, fruit, maybe something for dinner. It felt like a neutral mission, a task that could place us in a world where things were still simple. We got into the car without discussing who would drive, and I noticed how careful we both were not to touch when passing bags or reaching for our seatbelts. The drive took nearly an hour on winding roads. The town was small, the kind that seems untouched by time, old signage, sleepy storefronts, a few locals chatting outside a cafe. We split up in the small grocery store, moving through the aisles like strangers pretending not to know one another. I saw him 2 rows over, holding a box of crackers, and for a fleeting second I felt something absurd and sharp, something like longing, something like regret. He looked up and caught my gaze, and neither of us looked away immediately. That second stretched longer than it should have. Then we turned back to our tasks. Back in the car, the air between us felt a little thinner, the silence more companionable than strained. He turned on the radio, and the station was playing old jazz standards, melodies that reminded me of late dinners and candlelit silence from a life I used to live. I hummed softly along with one of the songs. He glanced at me and smiled, not a wide grin, just the kind of smile that acknowledged I was there and I was real. And I smiled back, because in that moment it felt easier than frowning. Halfway home, we passed an overlook point with a broad view of the forested valley below. He slowed the car, asked if I wanted to stop. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We stood side by side at the wooden rail, watching the wind ripple through the canopy below like waves. It was the kind of view people photograph and forget. But neither of us took out our phones. We stood there quietly for a while. Then he said, "I don't want to mess anything up." It was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I had too many things to say, and none of them made any sense in that moment. Instead, I touched the wooden railing with my fingertips and focused on the cold wind against my cheek. When we got back to the cabin, the sky had begun to gray over. We unpacked the groceries together, returning to our routine, chopping vegetables, boiling water, setting the table. It should have felt like any other evening, but everything now carried an echo. Every gesture had a shadow. Every silence had weight. While he prepared a pot of soup, I excused myself and stepped outside. The chill in the air helped clear my head. I sat on the edge of the porch and watched the sky darken. The forest made its own kind of music, branches swaying, birds settling in, the rustle of unseen animals. I let the quiet work through me like a bomb, but I couldn't stop thinking about how this trip had begun as a detour and had slowly turned into a threshold. I thought of my husband, how often we used to laugh over small things, how we used to hold hands under the table at restaurants, how once upon a time he made me feel seen. I didn't know exactly when that had stopped. It hadn't been a fight or a moment. Just a long, quiet drift away from each other, like 2 boats untethering from the same dock. When I returned inside, the lights were low and the soup was ready. We ate by candlelight, the power flickering slightly, old wiring, probably. He poured me another glass of wine, and we sipped it slowly. Conversation was minimal, but not unfriendly. When the meal ended, I stood to clear the table. He reached for the same plate I did, and our fingers touched again. This time, we both froze. It was such a small thing, an accidental contact. But it didn't feel small. Not at all. I set the plate down and walked away first, needing space, needing air. He didn't follow. Not then. Instead, he stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up as if nothing had shifted. Later, when I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling again, the way I had the night before. I listened for footsteps, but the house was silent. I considered getting up, going outside again, starting a fire, anything to break the weight in the room. But I didn't move. I stayed under the blanket and breathed slowly, trying to quiet the thoughts that wouldn't leave. And still, despite everything, a single truth kept rising through the noise: I didn't regret the kiss. I didn't regret the stillness that followed, or the unspoken feeling that something irreversible had started. I only regretted not understanding what I would do next. Or who I would be when I did. The rain began sometime during the night. I heard it before I saw it, a soft percussion on the metal roof, gentle but insistent, like the echo of something long overdue. It was still dark outside when I awoke, the sky only beginning to shift from black to navy. I didn't move. I listened. To the rain. To the quiet creaking of the cabin. To the muffled movements from the room below, his footsteps, deliberate, not trying to be quiet but not loud either. He was awake too. I stayed in bed longer than I needed to, letting the sound of water fill the space I didn't know how to name. It was the kind of rain that made you question your plans, the kind that erased trails and blurred windows. I wondered if we'd stay inside all day. I wondered if I wanted to. I wondered if that was safer, or more dangerous. When I finally went downstairs, he was seated at the table with a cup of tea, not coffee this time. The radio was playing softly, classical music, something melancholy and string-heavy. He looked up, met my eyes for just a second, then looked away. I poured myself a cup and sat opposite him. Neither of us said good morning. The weight of the previous day was still in the room with us. It clung to the furniture, hovered between sentences we didn't start. I thought about apologizing for the silence, for the awkwardness, but I didn't. I wasn't sorry. Not really. We passed the early hours separately. I curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't reading. He scribbled in his notebook, sketching something with quick, restless movements. I watched him once through the edge of my gaze, how his hand moved across the page, how his brow furrowed when he was focused. He hadn't shaved in days, and the scruff made him look older than I remembered. Or maybe just more real. Around noon, the rain slowed to a mist. He stood, stretched, and asked if I wanted to go outside for air. I nodded. We didn't need to talk about where we were going. The trail to the lake had become familiar now, like a shared memory that belonged to both of us. We walked slowly, the damp earth soft beneath our boots. The trees were dripping, their branches heavy and low. Everything smelled like moss and wet leaves, like something alive and ancient. Neither of us spoke until we reached the clearing near the water. There, he stopped and looked out across the gray surface of the lake. It was still, quiet. The kind of stillness that made sound seem like an intrusion. I stood beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body, but not touching. He spoke first. I think we should be careful. His voice was quiet, but clear. I nodded, unsure of what that meant, careful in words, in actions, in distance? Careful not to name the thing that had already begun to live between us? I wanted to ask him what he was afraid of. I wanted to say that I felt like I was standing on the edge of a life that had already moved on without me. But I didn't. I just said, okay. We stayed there for a while, silent again. He picked up a small rock and skipped it across the lake. It bounced once, twice, then sank. I realized I hadn't seen anyone skip a stone in years. It felt like something from a different decade. When we returned to the cabin, the clouds had lifted just enough to let a pale sun through. I made soup from what we had left, something warm and simple. He cleaned up without being asked. The rhythm of our coexistence was returning, but underneath it, the tension only deepened. Later that afternoon, I wandered into the small storage room in the back of the cabin. I had been looking for extra candles, but instead, I found a stack of old books, dusty and half forgotten. I flipped through one and something slipped out, a folded page. It was a letter, unfinished. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I read the first few lines before guilt made me stop. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it might as well have had my name at the top. It spoke of confusion. Of boundaries. Of being drawn to someone he shouldn't be. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was honest. Painfully so. I folded it carefully and put it back. When I returned to the main room, he was on the porch, staring out at the trees. I didn't say anything. I didn't mention what I found. But something in me had shifted. Not because I was shocked, but because I understood the courage it took to put those thoughts to paper, even if they were never meant to be seen. That evening, the rain returned. He brought in wood for the fireplace, and we sat close, sharing its warmth. The power flickered once, then came back. Outside, the world was cloaked in darkness. Inside, the light danced on the walls, soft and forgiving. We didn't touch. Not that night. But the air between us felt different. Like a string pulled tight but not yet snapped. When I went upstairs, I paused at the top of the steps. He looked up at me from the chair near the fire. Our eyes held for a moment. There was no promise in that look, no question. Just recognition. Quiet, steady, and unbearably real. In bed, I lay awake for hours. Listening to the storm. Replaying moments in my mind. Trying to make sense of the path we were on. Wondering whether there was still time to turn back, or whether we already had. By the time the rain stopped, the clouds had broken apart into long stretches of silver and white, and the forest had taken on that saturated stillness that only comes after hours of uninterrupted storm. I stood at the window with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm in my hands. The world outside looked both softer and more vivid, like someone had turned the contrast up on the sky and washed everything beneath it clean. Inside, though, nothing felt clean. Everything felt loaded. I hadn't spoken to him since the night before, not in any meaningful way. Words between us had started to feel too sharp, too revealing. It was easier to stay quiet. And yet silence brought its own kind of exposure. It left more room for the truth to breathe. He was in the back room, still sketching. I could hear the sound of pencil on paper. Every now and then, a chair would creak or a page would turn. The normalcy of it made the tension worse, not better. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. I only knew that pretending nothing had happened was becoming harder with each passing hour. I tried reading. I tried cleaning the kitchen. I tried walking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for things to do, little tasks to absorb my mind. But nothing stuck. My body was restless, as if it knew something needed to break and was bracing for it. Late that afternoon, I found myself standing on the edge of the path that led toward the lake again. Without thinking, I walked. The trail was muddy but passable, and the air carried the last traces of rain, rich, mineral, deep. When I reached the water, I sat down on a rock and stared at the ripples moving across the surface. The lake looked darker than usual, like it was holding something secret beneath. I wasn't alone for long. I heard his footsteps behind me before he spoke. He stopped a few feet away, not sitting, just standing there, as if unsure if he was welcome. I didn't look at him, but I didn't tell him to leave either. That was enough. Eventually, he stepped closer and sat beside me. Not touching, but close. Close enough for his presence to change the air. We both stared ahead, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. After a while, he said, "I keep thinking there's some perfect thing I could say to make this easier." I shook my head slowly. "There isn't." He nodded. That was all. More silence. But this one didn't feel hostile or awkward. It felt earned. It felt like we had arrived here after walking the long way around. He pulled something from his pocket, a small, folded piece of paper. Without looking at me, he held it out. I didn't take it at first. Just looked at his hand. Eventually, I reached over and accepted it. It was the letter. The one I had already read in secret. The gesture caught me off guard. I wrote it before we even came here, he said quietly. Didn't know if I'd ever give it to you. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Instead, I kept my hand closed around it and stared back at the water. When we stood to leave, I didn't speak. He followed behind me on the path, keeping a respectful distance, as though afraid that being too close would break something delicate. But something already had. That night, we made dinner together again. This time it was more intentional. The way we moved around each other had changed. There was less pretending. Fewer masks. We weren't playing house. We were just two people trying to be honest without collapsing under the weight of it. We ate in the glow of the fireplace, candles lit not for romance but because the overhead bulb had started flickering again. There was a softness in the room that hadn't been there before. Not a relief, but a kind of resolution. We weren't fighting it anymore, not even internally. After dinner, I washed dishes while he dried them. It should have been mundane. It wasn't. I dropped a fork into the sink too hard and the clang echoed through the space. He reached for it at the same time I did and our hands met underwater. This time, neither of us pulled back. I looked up. He looked at me. And we kissed. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It wasn't even surprising. It was slow. Certain. Like something inevitable had finally found the right time to arrive. When it ended, we didn't speak. He turned off the lights, leaving only the fire burning low in the hearth. I stood in the shadows, heart thudding. My palms were still wet from the dishwater. He walked to the stairs and paused at the bottom step, waiting. Not assuming. Just waiting. I walked past him, up the stairs, one slow step at a time. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. At the top, I turned into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. He followed a few minutes later, his footsteps quiet but sure. The firelight flickered in the hall behind him. We said nothing. We lay down. We faced each other. We kissed. And then we stopped trying to resist what we both already knew. But that night, we didn't go further. We didn't cross the line in a way that could never be undone. We simply stayed close. Let our hands rest where they landed. Let our breathing fall into sync. Let the silence between us speak the truth we couldn't yet say aloud. Sleep didn't come easily. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt known. I lay awake long after his breathing grew slow and even. I stared into the dark and thought about what morning would bring. About what I'd say, if anything. About what I'd lost. And what I'd found. The next morning arrived slowly, as if it too were unsure of what should come next. I woke before the light fully broke across the windows, the room still steeped in a blue haze that made everything feel softer than it was. He was already awake, lying beside me, eyes open, not moving. We didn't speak. Words had begun to feel like the least trustworthy part of us. We just looked at each other for a while, neither smiling, neither flinching. There was no regret in his eyes. Just something quiet. Steady. Measured. When he finally got up, he did so without a sound. He dressed in the soft light and left the room. I remained in bed, eyes on the ceiling, heart beating with the slow deliberation of someone who knows the direction they're walking in, even if they're not sure where the path leads. I joined him downstairs nearly an hour later. The fire had burned low, and he was folding blankets, tidying as if the ritual of domestic order could settle something inside him. I offered to make breakfast. He didn't object. We worked in silence again, but it had shifted, no longer an avoidance, but a kind of reverence for something we both understood was fragile. It felt, strangely, like peace. After we ate, he suggested a walk. The clouds had parted, and the world outside was bathed in amber. The trees shimmered with moisture. The forest floor smelled like roots and new beginnings. We walked side by side down an unfamiliar trail, one that split off from the usual path to the lake. It led uphill, winding between tall evergreens. We didn't say where we were going. We just walked. At the top, we found a small clearing, open sky above, soft moss beneath. He laid down his jacket on the ground and sat. I sat beside him. The view was nothing dramatic, just trees and sky, but it felt expansive. Like something in us needed space to stretch without explanation. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, then said, "I don't want to carry this like it's a secret." I understood what he meant, though he didn't clarify. There was nothing indecent between us. Nothing sordid. But still, we had crossed into something unnamed, something that lived outside the boundaries of the roles we were meant to inhabit. And whatever it was, it mattered. I said, "I don't want to forget it." That was the closest I could get to agreeing. We didn't touch that afternoon. We just sat in that high place, beneath a sky trying to decide between sun and shadow, and let the air speak for us. It wasn't romantic. It was something else. It was recognition. And it was rare. Back at the cabin, we resumed the motions of shared space. We chopped vegetables for soup, restocked the firewood, cleaned the floors. The electricity flickered again and then settled. I watched him light the oil lamp by the window, and I wondered how long it had been since I'd seen someone move so thoughtfully. There was something calming in his presence, not because he offered escape, but because he didn't demand anything. Later that evening, I pulled out my journal. I hadn't written in days, though I'd thought often of what I'd say. This time the words came quickly. I didn't write about guilt or hesitation. I wrote about awakening. About what it means to feel visible again. To be looked at not because you are a fixture in someone's life but because you are seen anew, as if for the first time. When I set the journal aside, I found him seated on the porch. The stars had started to break through the thinning clouds. I joined him. Neither of us wore jackets. The cold didn't matter. We sat close, but still not touching. It was enough. He asked, "What happens when we go back?" It was the question I had been avoiding for days. The one with no graceful answer. I said, "We carry it carefully." He nodded. Then he said, "I don't want it to be something we pretend didn't happen." Neither did I. But I also didn't want to explain it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The next morning would bring us closer to departure. The day after that, back to the city, to the world where our names were attached to other people, other duties. But tonight, we were just who we were. Two people who had quietly stepped into a space neither of us planned for and found something rare inside it. When we returned inside, I paused at the stairs. He walked past me without expectation. I followed slowly, the floorboards beneath my feet groaning softly in the quiet. In the room, we didn't speak. We simply undressed for bed the way two people do when they are no longer afraid of what closeness might mean. There was no ceremony, no hesitation, no need to define it. We climbed into bed, the same way we had the night before. No urgency. Just gravity. We spent the night together. And though nothing happened that could not be undone, nothing inside us remained unchanged. We fell asleep like that, quiet, breathing the same air, with nothing more than stillness between us. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking in the dark to search for something missing. The morning after was different. Not because anything visible had changed, but because everything inside me had. I woke to a room filled with stillness, the soft kind that blankets a space where something irreversible has passed. I opened my eyes slowly, adjusting to the muted gray light seeping through the curtains. He was already awake, lying on his back, eyes open, hands resting across his stomach. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no need to. We had crossed something in the night that couldn't be undone, and both of us knew it. There was no ceremony, no declaration. Just the quiet presence of having been with one another without turning away. Eventually, he sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed, stretching in silence. I remained under the blanket, following the slow rise and fall of my own breath. I didn't feel guilt. Not in the way I might have expected. What I felt was a kind of settled sorrow, like the kind that follows an ending you knew was coming but still hoped might be delayed. Downstairs, the morning routine resumed, but everything moved more deliberately. We spoke only when necessary, voices quiet and reserved. The kettle whistled, the toaster clicked, the fire crackled to life in the corner. I watched him move around the kitchen like a man who had taken a long walk through something sacred and now wasn't sure how to carry himself back into the ordinary. We ate together, but not across from each other. This time, side by side at the window bench, staring out at the trees. The forest felt farther away today, even though it hadn't moved. The color of the leaves had deepened overnight, and a subtle breeze made them tremble like a warning. I took another sip of tea, holding the warmth against my lips longer than necessary. He rested his elbows on his knees and let out a long, quiet breath. After breakfast, we decided to clean. The cabin wasn't messy, but the act gave our hands something to do. I dusted the bookshelves while he swept the front porch. I wiped down the counter while he gathered the firewood. We moved separately, but in rhythm, as if each of us understood that too much closeness now might break the delicate thread we were both still holding. Midday came quickly, and with it, a kind of invisible weight settled into the room. There were only 2 days left before we would leave. The thought lingered unspoken between us. He sat on the couch reading a book he hadn't opened all week, while I stood at the sink, washing dishes by hand. I watched the sunlight shift across the floor and wondered if anything back home would look the same to me again. After a while, I stepped out onto the porch, needing air. The sky was open and clean, with thin clouds drifting slowly above the treetops. I leaned against the railing and looked down at the dirt path leading to the trail. That path had become more than a trail to the lake. It had become a timeline, a silent record of every step that had brought us here. He joined me not long after, standing beside me but not too close. We stood that way for several minutes, both watching nothing in particular. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "I keep thinking there should be a way to make this make sense." I didn't respond. Not right away. Because I understood what he meant. This, what had happened, wasn't a story we could explain to anyone else. It didn't belong to language. It wasn't a decision. It was something quieter, older, like a current under the surface of a lake you thought was still. Finally, I said, "Some things just happen because we stop pretending they can't." He didn't answer, but I felt his agreement in the way he exhaled and looked away. A long, slow silence followed. One that didn't feel strained, but complete. That afternoon, we didn't walk. We didn't talk. We just shared space and let the day pass without trying to fill it. I wrote in my journal again, more than I had in weeks. Not about guilt, and not about escape, but about stillness. About connection. About what it means to be fully present with another person, even when you know it can't last. As evening approached, I lit candles around the room while he restocked the wood stove. The light turned amber, then gold, then gone. We ate leftovers for dinner and barely touched our glasses of wine. He played music from his phone, soft piano, slow and contemplative. I lay on the couch and listened, eyes closed, hands folded across my stomach like I was trying to hold something together inside myself. Later, we moved upstairs without a word. It was instinctive now, like muscle memory. The room was cool. The bed was already turned down. We didn't undress this time. We lay down fully clothed, side by side, eyes on the ceiling. He whispered, "If you asked me to forget this, I would." The words struck me like a whisper in an empty cathedral, soft, but echoing. "I won't," I said. I didn't want to forget. I didn't want to press this into the ground and bury it beneath duty or shame. It had been real. It had been quiet and strange and tender and complicated, but real. I needed that to count for something. We fell asleep like that, close but untouched, resting in the gravity of everything that had passed. No one reached for more. There was no next step to take. Only the certainty that what we had found in one another, however fleeting, had filled a space in each of us that had long gone unnoticed. In the darkness, as the wind picked up outside and the leaves whispered against the walls of the cabin, I understood something I hadn't before. It wasn't about what would happen next. It wasn't about consequence or correction. It was about the moment. About allowing one moment in time to exist exactly as it was, without apology or pretense. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to disappear to be at peace. I didn't have to lower my voice or shrink my presence. I could simply be. And that, I realized, was the most terrifying and beautiful truth of all. The air was cooler that morning. Crisp in a way that hinted at the coming shift of seasons. I could feel it even before I opened my eyes, the subtle change in temperature, the faint breeze pressing against the windows. I lay still for a long while, trying to memorize the exact weight of the blanket over my body, the scent of pine drifting through the room, and the quiet rhythm of another breath close beside mine. When I finally sat up, he was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, tying his shoes. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, like he was preparing for more than a simple walk. I watched in silence, unsure if this would be the day we finally acknowledged what the end of our time here really meant. 2 days, maybe less, until everything we'd quietly built, whatever name it might deserve, would have to be folded back into the lives we left behind. Downstairs, the cabin was quiet. The fire had died sometime during the night, and the chill had crept into the floorboards. I wrapped myself in a sweater and opened the back door to let the air in, as if inviting it to clear the fog inside me. The sky was clear, sunlight breaking through the tops of the trees in long, golden lines. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. He made coffee. I set the table. We moved in near silence, as had become our pattern, but the stillness wasn't tense. It was thoughtful. Measured. Like a long exhale that neither of us wanted to end too soon. After breakfast, he suggested a short hike to the ridge behind the cabin, a place we hadn't explored yet. I agreed without hesitation. Moving felt better than sitting. So we packed water, a few snacks, and set out on foot through a narrow, unfamiliar trail that twisted sharply uphill. The path was steep, the ground still damp from last week's rain, and for the first half hour, we didn't speak. When we reached the top, the view opened like a secret. A wide clearing overlooked miles of forest, layers of green and rust, broken only by a winding stream below. We sat on a flat rock, side by side. He took off his backpack and leaned back on his elbows, eyes fixed on the distance. For a long time, neither of us said anything. It was the kind of silence that asked to be kept. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "He called last night." I turned to look at him, not fully understanding. Then I realized he meant his father. My husband. I didn't answer, he added. I exhaled slowly, unsure what to do with that information. I felt my heart shift. Not panic. Not shame. Something heavier. The reminder that this world we had built, this soft, uncertain, temporary world, existed only because another one had been paused. He'll come soon, I said. He nodded. I know. We sat with that. Let the truth settle like dust in sunlight. There was no use pretending we didn't know this was temporary. But that didn't make it meaningless. Eventually, we made our way back down. The silence between us had grown heavier, not in resentment, but in the gravity of knowing we were reaching the bottom of something we couldn't climb again. Back at the cabin, I began tidying up. Not because it needed it, but because I didn't know what else to do. I swept the floor, reorganized the small bookshelf, folded blankets that had already been folded. He took a call outside, brief, hushed. When he returned, I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. His expression told me everything. We made dinner early. Something simple: eggs, toast, roasted vegetables from what remained in the fridge. We ate quietly, exchanging only a few looks across the table. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, the windows glowing with soft orange light. After dinner, he handed me a small envelope. Unsealed, my name written on the front in his handwriting. I didn't open it. I didn't ask what it said. He said, I wanted to leave something behind. Not for you to keep. Just, to be honest. I placed it on the mantel beside the fire and gave a small nod. I didn't trust my voice to respond. That night, we didn't sit outside. We didn't build a fire. We simply turned off the lights and went upstairs, both of us moving slowly, as if walking through the ending of a film we didn't want to finish. We didn't talk. We didn't kiss. We lay down beside each other, fully clothed, a stretch of quiet between us like a river we could no longer cross. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of wind through the trees. And for the first time in days, I let my mind wander back to the man I had married. I thought of the early years, full of laughter, travel, shared secrets whispered in bed. I thought of how that version of us had thinned over time, become quiet, predictable, efficient. I wondered what version he believed I still was. Beside me, I could feel the warmth of another person who had never tried to save me, never tried to fix me, only offered presence. I realized I didn't need to be rescued. I had only wanted to be remembered. Not as someone's wife, someone's responsibility, but as myself. I didn't sleep much that night. Nor did he. We didn't touch. We didn't speak. But something passed between us, something that didn't need movement or words. It lived in the stillness. In the ache of nearing goodbye. In the knowledge that we had crossed into each other's lives at exactly the moment we weren't supposed to, and maybe exactly when we needed it most. The next morning began with the sound of tires on gravel. I heard it before I was fully awake, a low, slow crunch that didn't belong to forest or birdsong. My eyes opened to gray light and the faint hum of an engine idling beyond the window. For a second, my mind tried to deny it, to place it somewhere harmless. But then I heard the car door close. Firm. Familiar. Final. I sat up too fast. The blanket slid from my shoulders, and I stared out the window in disbelief. There was the car, parked just beside the porch, speckled with dust from the long drive, exactly as I remembered it. And stepping out with one hand gripping a travel bag and the other adjusting his jacket, was my husband. The moment fractured something inside me. Not because I was caught. We hadn't done anything to be caught in the conventional sense. But because I realized I had built two entire versions of myself, and they were about to meet, face to face. I stood at the edge of the bed, breath stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. I turned slowly toward the doorway. He had heard it too. He was already pulling on his jacket. His eyes met mine, and something in them flickered, not panic, not fear, but recognition. We both knew what this moment was. I moved first. I went downstairs quickly, my hand skimming the banister for balance. My heart raced in a rhythm that made it hard to breathe, but my face was calm. I opened the door just as my husband stepped onto the porch. He looked surprised to see me so quickly, then smiled. It wasn't wide. Just soft, tired. The kind of smile people give when they've been on the road too long and they're finally where they intended to be. I thought I'd come a day early, he said. I missed you. The words landed like a weight I hadn't prepared for. I nodded, said something neutral, I don't even remember what. My voice sounded normal, which startled me more than anything. Behind me, I heard a door close upstairs. Quiet. Controlled. Then slow steps descending. I turned slightly and saw him reach the bottom of the stairs, expression unreadable, movement careful. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at his father. They exchanged polite hellos. A nod. A short remark about the weather. It was all so composed that I felt like I was the only person aware of the tremor beneath it. I stepped aside so my husband could enter. He set his bag down and looked around the cabin as if it were a place he'd never seen before, even though we'd picked it together from a website over a glass of wine, months ago. He commented on how cozy it was, how much he was looking forward to some quiet. He asked if everything had gone smoothly. I said yes. And then we were three again. Just like that. Sitting in the same room, pretending the air hadn't changed, pretending there wasn't a silent current running under our feet. He asked about meals, whether we'd eaten yet. I said we'd had coffee and toast. He offered to go out and grab something, suggested maybe a quick drive into town. He said it casually, but there was a tone, an eagerness to create space, or maybe to test it. I offered to go with him, but he declined. Said I should rest. He looked at his son and asked if he needed anything from town. A pause followed, then a shake of the head. He left soon after, the sound of the engine pulling away as heavy as the sound of it arriving. When the cabin was quiet again, I exhaled in a way I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. He stood by the kitchen table, arms folded, gaze unfocused. That was more than I thought it would be, I said finally. He gave a small nod. I didn't expect it to feel like this. Like what? Like the ending already started, he said. We didn't speak again for a while. There was nothing to say. Everything had been condensed into moments, into glances, into the half-second that passed between greeting and truth. He went outside not long after, saying he needed air. I watched him disappear beyond the trees, his silhouette swallowed by green and light. Alone in the cabin, I sat by the fireplace, staring into unlit logs. I thought of all the versions of myself I had been in this space. The one who arrived reluctant. The one who found comfort. The one who let go. And now, the one who had to choose how much of herself would remain when this place was behind her. My husband returned late in the afternoon with groceries. He moved around the kitchen with ease, asking questions, offering stories about the road, about a colleague who called him last night, about things that no longer felt real to me. I nodded. I smiled. I even laughed once. And all the while, I watched him without really watching, wondering how long it would take him to sense the change in me, if he ever would. That night, the three of us had dinner together. The table was quiet. He commented on the food, said it tasted better than anything he'd made lately. His son nodded, thanked him for bringing dessert. I asked about the drive home and how much time we had left here. He said we could stay another 2 nights if we wanted. Later, I stood on the porch alone, wrapped in a shawl, the night cool against my skin. Behind me, laughter drifted through the walls, his voice, familiar and warm. For a moment, I closed my eyes and tried to imagine this life as whole again. Intact. Seamless. But all I could feel was the fracture beneath it. And I knew, without question, that when we left this place, something would stay behind. Something of me. Something of us. Something that couldn't survive beyond these trees, these shadows, this silence. I would carry the memory like a stone in my pocket, small, solid, invisible. Always there. Always shifting. Never spoken of again. The morning we left the cabin, the sky was overcast. Pale and even, as if the light itself was hesitant to draw lines between what had been and what would come next. I woke before either of them. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt too complete. I stayed in bed a few extra minutes, letting the stillness settle into me, trying to memorize the weight of the blankets, the faint creak of wood, the coolness of the floorboards when my feet finally touched down. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and pine smoke from the night before. The fireplace had gone cold. I didn't relight it. I didn't boil water. I didn't open the windows. Instead, I moved quietly through the space, gathering the few items I had brought, folding sweaters, zipping bags. Every movement felt final, even though I tried not to think of it that way. He wasn't up yet. Neither of them were. And in that quiet, I could feel the edges of myself hardening again, reshaping for the return to something known, something practiced. He came downstairs an hour later. Our eyes met only briefly. No smile. No exchange. Just the slow movement of people adjusting to an old rhythm after too much time spent outside of it. He walked past me, set a mug on the counter, rinsed something in the sink. His presence felt different now, distant, like someone I had met in a story I wasn't supposed to tell. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask him to. My husband came down last, stretching, yawning, commenting on how well he'd slept. He was in good spirits, as if the air here had healed something in him. I watched the way he moved around the kitchen, casual, light, offering to make breakfast, already talking about which road we should take home. His energy filled the room, made it brighter, louder. I nodded when appropriate, responded where necessary, but it felt like watching someone else live inside a life that no longer belonged entirely to me. We ate together, toast, eggs, coffee. The conversation floated from place to place. He asked his son about work, plans for the winter. They exchanged a few thoughtful remarks, as if trying to remember what their normal looked like. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere. Not distracted. Just quiet. Settled in a place I didn't have words for. When breakfast ended, I offered to clean up. I needed something for my hands to do. He started helping, but my husband waved us off, insisting we get ready to leave while he took care of the rest. It was his way of giving. Of reclaiming usefulness. I let him. I returned upstairs, zipped the last bag, stood in the center of the room for a long moment. It looked exactly as it had the day we arrived, neat, still, impersonal. No trace of what had happened lingered in the corners, no scent in the fabric, no impression on the bed. It was as if we'd never been anything other than guests. He was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when I came down, his bag already in hand. My husband was outside, loading the car. We stood in silence. Then he nodded once, small, almost imperceptible. I didn't respond, but I didn't look away either. Outside, we loaded the car and practiced coordination. I took the passenger seat. My husband drove. He sat in the back, behind me. The engine turned over, gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the cabin disappeared behind us, small, wooden, unbothered. No sign that it had held anything unusual. Just a structure in the woods, ready for the next strangers to come and live their private stories inside it. The drive was long. Conversation between the men rose and fell, touching on unimportant things. Sports. Gas prices. Weather patterns. I watched the trees blur past the window, each mile peeling us further away from what had been. My husband reached for my hand once. I let him take it. My fingers curled automatically around his, but there was no heat in the gesture. Just habit. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to look forward in the same way again. When we reached the city, everything felt too loud. Too precise. The streets were lined with people, shops, traffic lights blinking in perfect time. The silence of the forest was gone. Replaced by movement, by function, by life as it had always been. We pulled into the driveway. My husband turned off the engine and announced something about unpacking later. He was hungry again. Inside the house, everything was where we left it. Mail stacked on the console. The blanket still folded on the couch. The hallway mirror reflected our shapes as we passed by, casting them back without judgment. I placed my bag by the stairs and took off my coat. My husband kissed my cheek and disappeared into the kitchen. I heard the fridge open, the rustle of a grocery bag. He stood in the doorway behind me. Not entering. Not speaking. Just standing there, waiting for something neither of us would say. I turned toward him slowly. For a second, we just stood that way, eyes locked, the space between us full of everything we couldn't speak in this house. Then I gave the faintest nod. Not goodbye. Not closure. Just acknowledgement. Then I turned away. He left quietly. No door slammed. No shoes on the floor. Just absence. Later, my husband asked if the trip had helped. If I'd gotten the rest I needed. I said yes. He smiled and kissed my temple and told me he was glad. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house slowly, touching familiar things. The picture frame on the wall. The small crack in the window by the stairs. The wine glass on the drying rack. I stood by the window and stared into the dark. No stars. No wind. Just city light and the hum of faraway cars. I didn't cry. I didn't write anything down. I didn't relive the moments or try to hold on to them. I let them rest. But inside me, something had shifted. A quiet reshaping. A return not to what I was, but to someone I had once left behind without realizing. In the morning, I would wake beside the man I had promised to love. I would make coffee. I would water the plants. I would step back into the rhythm of everything that came before. But I would carry something invisible now. Not guilt. Not regret. Just the truth of having once been seen. Fully. Quietly. Without conditions. And though no one else would ever know what had happened in that cabin, I would. And I would never forget.